Picture this, a field so thick with corpses that the earth has vanished. Crows circle overhead, their cries drowning in the moans of the dying. The summer sun beats down on a landscape painted in viscera. Entrails draped across broken spear shafts, severed limbs twisted at angles that mock the human form, horses screaming as they thrash in their own intestines. The smell is beyond description. Iron and excrement and something sweeter, something worse. The first sickly sweet rot beginning its work before the battle has even ended. A boy stands at the edge of this hell. He's perhaps 12, perhaps 14, old enough to understand what he's seeing, young enough that his mind will never fully recover from it. His armour is too large. It belonged to someone else this morning. That someone is now part of the carpet of flesh beneath his feet. And then the procession begins. Ottoman soldiers drag something through the carnage. At first it looks like a bundle of rags dark with blood. Then the boy sees the face, the beard matted with gore, the eyes still open, still wearing an expression of defiance that death has failed to erase. It is his father's head. The soldiers carry it toward a tent where silk banners snap in a wind that carries the stench of 20,000 dead. Inside that tent sits Sultan Murad I, or what remains of him. The Sultan is dying too, stabbed by a Serbian noble who pretended to defect. But dying is not dead, and before the light leaves his eyes, Murad will have his prize. The boy watches as his father's head is placed before the gasping Sultan. He watches Ottoman hands force open his father's mouth, watches them spit into it, watches them laugh. He cannot look away. Something tells him, some animal instinct for survival, that looking away now would be the last thing he ever does. Historians still debate whether young Stefan Lazarevic actually witnessed this moment. The chronicles are unclear. Some say he was kept miles from the battlefield. Others place him at his father's side until the final charge. But here is what we know with certainty. When Stefan walked away from Kosovo Polje, the field of blackbirds, he walked away as property. His father, Prince Lazar, had gambled Serbia's independence on a single battle. He lost. And the price of that loss was everything, including his son. The new Sultan, Bayezid, Murad's son, a man they would call the Thunderbolt for the speed of his conquests, looked at the defeated Serbian nobles and saw tools. The boy Stefan was small, slight, with intelligent eyes that had just watched his father's decapitation. Bayezid saw potential. He saw a hostage valuable enough to ensure Serbian loyalty. He saw, perhaps, a future weapon. Stefan Lazarevic would spend the next 38 years proving Bayezid right. He would become the greatest Serbian military commander of his age. He would write poetry that scholars still study. He would build fortresses that still stand. He would be dubbed a Knight of the Holy Roman Empire and welcomed in the courts of Hungary and Constantinople. And he would do all of it while wearing Ottoman chains. This is not a story about a hero who fought for freedom. This is a story about a man who fought for survival, and what survival cost him. A man who led Christian knights against Christian crusaders. A man who saved the empire that enslaved his people. A man who accepted honours from kings while paying tribute to sultans. The dragon, they called him. He wore the symbol on his armour, breathed fire in a dozen battles, terrified enemies across 3 continents. But dragons in the end are just weapons, and weapons do not choose their wielders. How does a boy watch his father's head defiled by the men who killed him, and then spend his life serving those same men? What does that do to a soul? What does that make a man? The crows at Kosovo had no answers. They simply fed. The road to the Ottoman court took 3 weeks. Stefan rode in relative comfort. He was a prince, after all, even if he was also a prisoner. But comfort is a relative term. Every mile took him further from the graves of 20,000 Serbians. Every mile brought him closer to the men who had dug those graves. The Ottoman capital at Bursa sprawled across the slopes of Mount Uludag like a fever dream of wealth and violence. Silk traders from China haggled beside slave merchants from the Crimea. Mosques rose next to bathhouses, next to barracks where janissaries drilled with mechanical precision. The air smelled of spices and horse dung and the particular metallic tang of an empire preparing for war. Stefan was given quarters befitting his status. A room with carpets, servants, regular meals. He was not chained, he was not beaten. This, he learned quickly, was how the Ottomans preferred to do things. Why break a tool when you can sharpen it? His education began immediately. Turkish language first, and Stefan proved an apt student, his ear for poetry translating into an ear for the melodic complexities of Ottoman court speech. Then military science, the organisation of Timar cavalry, the logistics of siege warfare, the proper deployment of Akinci raiders to soften an enemy before the main assault. He learned to read terrain the way his captors did, calculating distances in terms of horse endurance and water sources. And he learned, most importantly, to be useful. The Ottoman court was a garden of knives. Bayezid had brothers, and Bayezid's brothers had supporters, and every faction sought advantages wherever they could find them. A Serbian prince, intelligent, multilingual, with connections to the Balkan Christian nobility, was an asset worth cultivating. Stefan found himself invited to councils, asked for insights about Serbian fortifications, consulted on the best routes through Balkan mountain passes. He told them everything. What choice did he have? Historians still debate whether Stefan's cooperation was purely survival or something more complex. Some Serbian nationalists prefer to imagine secret resistance, coded messages to rebels back home, a heart that remained pure beneath the Ottoman silk. The evidence suggests otherwise. Stefan didn't just survive the Ottoman court, he thrived in it. He made himself indispensable not through reluctant compliance, but through genuine excellence. That first winter, a minor rebellion broke out in Anatolia. Some local lord had decided the new sultan was too focused on European conquests, had left his Asian territories vulnerable. Bayezid crushed it personally, and he brought his Serbian hostage along to watch. Stefan saw what happened to men who bet against the thunderbolt. Impalement was the preferred method. Stakes driven through the body from groin to shoulder, positioned so the victim might live for days, might watch crows eat his own intestines while his heart still beat. The rebel lord lasted 3 days. His screams could be heard from the Sultan's tent, where Bayezid conducted business as usual, pausing occasionally to smile at the sound. You see, Bayezid told Stefan that night, what becomes of those who forget their place. The boy nodded. He was perhaps 15 now, old enough to understand the lesson, young enough to let it reshape him. By his 18th birthday, Stefan commanded Ottoman cavalry in minor skirmishes. By 20, he led a Tumen, 10,000 horsemen, in raids across Wallachia. His reputation grew. The Serbian who fought like a Turk, the Christian who understood Muslim tactics, the hostage who had become a hunting dog. Back in Serbia, his mother Helena ruled as regent, walking her own impossible line between Ottoman demands and popular resentment. She sent Stefan letters when she could, carefully worded, vetted by Ottoman censors, stripped of anything that might be called sentiment. He wrote back in kind. They were performing a play for their captors, and both knew the price of breaking character. But something was happening to Stefan that letters couldn't capture. He was beginning to see the world through Ottoman eyes, the efficiency of their system, the brutal logic of their expansion. Serbia had been a kingdom of feuding nobles, regional loyalties, armies that assembled too slowly and dissolved too quickly. The Ottomans were something else, a machine for conquest, every part precisely engineered. And Stefan was becoming one of those parts. He stopped dreaming of Kosovo, the crows stopped visiting his sleep. His father's face grew hazy in memory, replaced by maps and troop dispositions and the particular rhythm of Turkish war drums. This was survival. This was what survival required. Or at least that's what he told himself. The first time Stefan saved Bayezid's life, he didn't think about it. Instinct took over, the kind of instinct that years of training had burned into muscle memory. An assassin's blade, a pivot. Stefan soared through the man's throat before anyone else had registered the threat. The would-be killer gurgled and fell, blood pooling on the marble floor of the Sultan's reception chamber, and Bayezid looked at his Serbian vassal with something new in his eyes. Not gratitude, exactly. The thunderbolt didn't do gratitude, but recognition, assessment, the acknowledgement that this tool was sharper than expected. "You move quickly," Bayezid said, "for a Christian." Stefan cleaned his blade on the dead man's robes. "I move quickly for anyone, my Sultan." Something like a smile crossed Bayezid's face. It did not reach his eyes, nothing ever did, but it was enough. From that day forward, Stefan rode closer to the Sultan in battle, close enough to kill him if he'd wanted, close enough to save him again when the need arose, and the need arose often. The 1390s were Bayezid's decade of expansion. Bulgaria fell, then parts of Greece, then most of Anatolia. The thunderbolt moved so fast that European observers couldn't track his armies. He would appear in Constantinople's suburbs, then materialise 600 miles away to crush an Anatolian rebellion, then reappear in the Balkans before his enemies had finished assembling their defence. Stefan was with him for all of it. He learned to sleep in the saddle during forced marches. He learned to read the moment when enemy formations would break, a subtle shifting in the line, a hesitation that preceded collapse. He learned the sound a man makes when a lance takes him through the chest cavity. Not a scream, but a wet exhalation, almost peaceful, as if the body were releasing something it had held too long. In 1393, Stefan led the Ottoman vanguard at the siege of Tarnovo, the Bulgarian capital. The city had held out for 3 months, trusting in its walls and its patriarch's prayers. Stefan's engineers found the weak point in the southern fortifications. His assault troops went through at dawn, when the defenders' attention had flagged after another sleepless night. The sack of Tarnovo lasted 3 days. Stefan did not participate directly. He was too valuable to risk in street fighting, but he watched from the citadel as Ottoman soldiers methodically stripped the city of everything valuable: gold, silver, slaves, and that particular dignity that belongs to places that have never been conquered. The Bulgarian patriarch was captured and brought before Bayezid. The Sultan had him strangled with a silk cord slowly, while court poets composed verses celebrating the victory. Stefan composed verses too. His poetry from this period survives, elegant, melancholic, full of imagery borrowed from both Serbian tradition and Persian court literature. He wrote about the transience of glory, the certainty of death, the way autumn leaves fall without knowing why. He did not write about Tarnovo. He did not write about the screaming. Historians still debate whether Stefan felt remorse for his role in Ottoman conquests. His poetry suggests a soul capable of reflection, even grief. His military record suggests a man who had learned to compartmentalise perfectly, who could watch a civilization be dismantled before breakfast and compose philosophical verses before dinner. By 1395, Stefan was perhaps the most trusted military commander in the Ottoman Empire who wasn't Turkish by birth. Bayezid relied on him for European operations, where Stefan's understanding of Christian tactics and terrain proved invaluable. He knew which nobles could be bribed, which cities would surrender quickly, which mountain passes could be forced, and which required negotiation with local powers. He knew because these had been his people once, because he still remembered the names of Serbian nobles, the layout of Serbian castles, the old songs his father had sung. That knowledge was currency now. Currency spent in service of the Thunderbolt. Back in Serbia, his mother continued her impossible regency. She paid tribute, supplied troops, maintained the fiction that Serbia was anything other than an Ottoman province with a Christian figurehead. She sent Stefan news of home, which nobles had died, which had surrendered, which had fled to Hungary in hope of finding some court that wasn't yet under the shadow of the crescent moon. Stefan filed the information away. Useful data, strategic intelligence. He had stopped thinking of Serbia as home. Home was wherever the Sultan's tent stood. Home was the space between commands, the brief peace before the next campaign. Home was the inside of his own skull, where a small, quiet voice still remembered his father's head and asked questions he couldn't afford to answer. The dragon was being forged, scale by bloody scale. The crusade came out of the west like a fever dream of chivalry. 20,000 knights in gleaming armour, pennants snapping in the wind, the flower of European nobility riding to save Christendom from the Turkish menace. French counts and German barons and Hungarian cavalry and Burgundian men-at-arms, all convinced that God was on their side and that conviction was enough to defeat the infidel. Stefan watched them assemble from the walls of an Ottoman forward position. He knew many of their names. He had studied their family histories, their military records, their weaknesses. He knew that the French contingent under Jean de Nevers was brave to the point of suicidal stupidity. He knew the Hungarian King Sigismund was a cautious tactician whose advice would be ignored by the arrogant Western knights. He knew that this gleaming host had no idea what it was riding into. "They think we're savages," Bayezid said, standing beside him. "They think they'll scatter us like their ancestors scattered the Saracens." "They've never fought a real Ottoman army," Stefan replied. "Only raiders, garrisons. They don't understand what you've built." Bayezid's smile was cold. "Show them." September 25th, 1396. The fields outside Nicopolis, where the Danube curves through Bulgarian territory. The Crusaders had besieged the Ottoman fortress for 2 weeks, growing restless, their discipline fraying in the heat and boredom. When Bayezid's army appeared on the southern horizon, the French knights saw glory, not danger. They charged, no reconnaissance, no coordination with their allies, no understanding that the light cavalry they could see was bait, that the main Ottoman force was hidden in the hills beyond, that they were riding into the most perfectly executed trap in medieval military history. Stefan commanded the Serbian contingent on the Ottoman left flank. His orders were simple: wait until the French exhausted themselves against the stake wall defences, then hit them from the side when they were committed and couldn't retreat. Simple orders. Clean orders. The kind of orders that don't require you to think about what you're doing. The French cavalry smashed into the Ottoman defensive positions with the force of 10,000 armoured knights at full gallop. Stakes shattered, men and horses screamed. The first line of Ottoman defenders died almost instantly, their sacrifice buying time for the second line to reform. The French pushed forward, convinced they were winning, convinced one more charge would break the infidel centre. Then the Sipahi counterattack came, then Stefan's Serbians hit the flank. The sound was like nothing Stefan had experienced before, not just the clash of metal, he'd heard that 100 times, but the scale of it. The way 20,000 voices merged into a single roar of agony and rage, the way the ground shook as cavalry formations collided, the way the air itself seemed to thicken with blood. Stefan's sword rose and fell in mechanical rhythm. He killed men whose heraldry he recognised. French nobles, German knights, Hungarian cavalry who had probably been baptised in the same faith as his father. Their faces blurred together. He stopped seeing faces. He saw only targets, angles of attack, the exposed joints in armour where a blade could find purchase. Historians still debate whether Stefan could have refused this duty. Some argue that his position was impossible, that fighting alongside his captors was simple survival. Others point out that he didn't just fight, he commanded, he led. He made decisions that maximised Christian casualties. His tactical skill at Nicopolis was remarked upon by Ottoman chroniclers as exceptional even by their standards. The battle lasted until sunset. By the time the killing stopped, the cream of European chivalry lay dead or captured across 3 miles of Bulgarian farmland. King Sigismund escaped by boat down the Danube. Barely. Jean de Nevers was captured and would be ransomed for the modern equivalent of millions of dollars. Thousands of lesser knights simply vanished, their bodies stripped, their armour carted off to Ottoman armouries, their bones left for the crows. Bayezid celebrated that night with a mass execution. Prisoners were brought before him in groups of 10, forced to kneel, beheaded one by one while the Sultan watched. The sources say he killed 3,000 men this way, though numbers from medieval chroniclers are always suspect. Stefan was present. He had to be present. Attendance was compulsory for senior commanders. The heads piled up like cordwood. The blood pooled so deep it reflected the torchlight. Stefan thought briefly of his father, of a different field of corpses, a different pile of heads. He wondered if Bayezid was thinking of his father too, of Murad, who had died at Kosovo, whose death this massacre was meant to avenge. Circles within circles, blood answering blood. When it was over, Bayezid promoted Stefan to a command rank typically reserved for born Muslims. "You have earned this," the Sultan said. "Today you are more useful than any 10 of my pashas." Stefan bowed. "I serve at my Sultan's pleasure." The words came easily now. They meant nothing. They meant everything. The aftermath of Nicopolis changed the map of Europe. With the Crusade destroyed, no Christian power dared challenge Ottoman expansion for a generation. Bayezid's reputation became something approaching mythological. The thunderbolt who had humbled the combined might of Western Christendom, who had drowned French chivalry in its own blood, who could not be stopped by any force on earth. And Stefan Lazarevich, the Serbian vassal who had helped make it happen, finally received permission to go home. He entered Serbia in the spring of 1397, riding at the head of an Ottoman-supplied escort. His mother Helena met him at the border. The sources say she wept when she saw him. They do not say whether the tears were joy or grief or some complicated mixture that has no name. Stefan was 30 now. He had spent half his life in Ottoman service. He had last seen Serbia as a boy being led away from his father's corpse. Now he returned as a man, as the only legitimate male heir to the Lazarevic dynasty, as a tested military commander with a reputation that crossed continental boundaries, as the dragon who had burned Christendom at Nicopolis. Also as a vassal. Always as a vassal. The terms of his return were clear. Serbia would provide troops for Ottoman campaigns. Stefan himself would lead them when summoned. Serbia would pay annual tribute in gold and silver. Serbia would not forge alliances with Hungary or any other Christian power without Ottoman approval. Serbia would, in all practical matters, remain an Ottoman province with a Christian prince as administrator. In exchange, the Ottomans would leave Serbian churches standing. Serbian nobles could keep their lands provided they didn't resist. Serbian peasants could maintain their faith, their customs, their songs. It was the deal his mother had negotiated to keep the country intact while her son learned to slaughter in foreign fields. Stefan accepted it. What choice was there? His first years as ruler were spent consolidating. Serbia had fractured during his absence. Regional lords had grown accustomed to acting independently, and more than a few had begun treating Helena's regency as a convenient fiction. Stefan toured his domains, met with every significant noble, assessed loyalties and resentments with the calculating eye the Ottomans had taught him. Some lords came around quickly, seeing in Stefan a strong hand that might finally impose order. Others required persuasion. A few required more than persuasion. The chronicles mention 3 executions in Stefan's first year of rule. Local magnates who had grown too powerful, who had begun collecting their own tribute, who imagined that the new prince might be manipulated or ignored. Stefan invited them to meetings under flags of truce. He listened to their concerns, their demands, their thinly veiled threats. Then he had them killed. Cleanly, efficiently, without ceremony. Historians still debate whether Stefan learned this tactic from the Ottomans, or whether it came naturally. Perhaps it doesn't matter. The result was the same. Within 18 months, no Serbian noble doubted who ruled, or what the cost of resistance would be. But ruling Serbia meant more than crushing dissent. It meant building fortifications, churches, monasteries, the infrastructure of a state that might endure. Stefan threw himself into construction projects with the same intensity he'd brought to military campaigns. The fortress of Belgrade was expanded and strengthened. New defensive positions rose along the Hungarian border. The monastery at Rasava began to take shape, its walls designed to house scholars as well as monks. And through it all, the tribute payments continued. Ottoman tax collectors arrived on schedule. Serbian troops marched south when Bayezid summoned them. The fiction of independence remained just that, a fiction, useful for keeping Serbian peasants compliant, meaningless in any practical sense. Stefan's court became a strange hybrid. Serbian traditions mixed with Ottoman administrative practices. Orthodox priests shared space with Turkish-trained scribes. Poetry flourished. Stefan himself wrote extensively, his verses circulating among the literate elite of both Christian and Muslim courts. He cultivated an image of the philosopher prince, the warrior who could also compose elegies, the practical ruler who understood that culture was a form of power. Behind closed doors, his mother continued to advise him. Helena had kept Serbia alive through 17 years of impossible diplomacy. She understood the game better than anyone. When to pay, when to delay, when to offer just enough cooperation to avoid punishment without becoming fully complicit. But Stefan was already fully complicit. Nicopolis had settled that question forever. He built his monasteries with Christian prayer and Ottoman tribute. He defended his borders with soldiers trained in Turkish tactics. He wrote his poetry in a language shaped by both traditions, using metaphors borrowed from Persian mystics and Serbian folk tales. He was becoming something new, something that had never existed before, a man who belonged nowhere, who served everyone, who trusted nothing except his own survival. The dragon had a kingdom now. The chains were invisible. The cage was made of silk. The Mongols came out of the east like a biblical plague. Tamerlane, Timur the Lame, the sword of Islam, the man who built pyramids from the skulls of his enemies, had spent 3 decades conquering everything from Delhi to Damascus. Now his gaze turned toward the Ottoman Empire, and Bayezid, for all his speed and fury, was about to learn what it felt like to be the smaller predator. Stefan received the summons in the spring of 1402. All vassal troops were to assemble. The Sultan was marching east to face the Mongol threat. The Serbian contingent numbered perhaps 5,000 men, cavalry mostly, the mounted lancers who had proven so effective at Nicopolis. Stefan led them personally, as he always did when Bayezid called. This was different from European campaigns though. This was fighting on Asian soil, against an enemy whose reputation made the Ottomans look almost civilized by comparison. The march took months, across Anatolia, through territories that had only recently been conquered, past cities that still smouldered from Mongol raids. Stefan saw the aftermath of Tamerlane's methods. Not just destruction, but deliberate terror. Populations massacred to the last child. Towers of heads left standing as monuments to resistance's futility. By the time the Ottoman army reached the plain of Ankara, Stefan understood what they were facing. This wasn't a battle. This was a collision between apocalypses. July 20th, 1402. The largest battle in medieval Asian history. 200,000 men, perhaps more, sources vary wildly, spread across miles of sun-scorched plain. The heat was murderous, the kind that kills horses and men alike without any help from enemy swords. Water sources had been systematically poisoned or diverted by Mongol advance parties. The Ottoman army arrived thirsty, exhausted, already bleeding men to desertion. And then the Anatolian vassals switched sides. Historians still debate whether this was Tamerlane's masterwork of bribery or simply opportunistic betrayal. Either way, the result was catastrophic. Units that Bayezid had counted on, tens of thousands of cavalry from recently conquered territories, wheeled around mid-battle and charged their former masters. The Ottoman line, already stretched thin, began to collapse. Stefan's Serbians held their position. They were Christians, despised by Tamerlane as infidels, with no possibility of switching allegiances. They were also, not coincidentally, positioned where the fighting was heaviest. The next hours were slaughter without meaning. Stefan saw formations disintegrate, saw men who had served together for decades cut each other down in the chaos, saw the Ottoman war machine, that perfect engine of conquest he had spent his life studying, come apart like a cheap toy. His own troops fought in contracting circles, backs to each other, selling their lives for minutes, for seconds, for nothing except the instinct that keeps men fighting after hope is gone. The sound of Mongol drums never stopped. That was what Stefan remembered afterward. Not the screaming, not the clash of weapons, but the drums. A heartbeat for the end of the world. Bayezid was captured near sunset. The thunderbolt, the terror of Christendom, the man who had crushed every army sent against him, taken alive, dragged before Tamerlane in chains. The sources disagree about what happened next. Some say Tamerlane treated him with respect, as one conqueror to another. Others say he was caged like an animal, displayed as a trophy, forced to watch while his wives served at Mongol feasts. What we know for certain, Bayezid died in captivity within 8 months. Some say he beat his head against the bars of his cage until his skull cracked. Some say he simply stopped eating. The empire he had built began devouring itself before his body was cold. Stefan survived Ankara. Barely. His Serbian contingent was reduced to perhaps 1,000 men, remnants who had somehow fought through the encirclement and escaped west. They rode for weeks, hunted by Mongol patrols, starving, many dying of wounds that festered in the summer heat. When they finally crossed back into Ottoman territory, there was no Ottoman territory. The empire had shattered. Bayezid's sons were already fighting each other for the scraps, each claiming legitimacy, each recruiting whatever forces they could find. The man Stefan had served for 15 years, the master he had saved at Nicopolis, the sultan whose orders had defined his adult life. Gone, caged and broken and dead in a Mongol tent. And here's where it gets worse, because Stefan was free now, in a sense. The chains had been cut. The master was dead. He could have stayed in Serbia, could have used the chaos to consolidate independence, could have been simply a Serbian prince instead of an Ottoman weapon. But old habits don't die with sultans. And Stefan had learned something at Ankara that he would never forget. There is no safety. There is no final victory. There is only the next threat, the next master, the next war. The dragon had watched an empire fall. It had not made him hope. It had made him afraid. The Ottoman civil war lasted 11 years. Bayezid's sons, Suleiman, Mehmed, Isa, Musa, fought each other with the same ferocity their father had directed at Christians. Alliances shifted monthly. Betrayals became the standard form of diplomacy. Brothers murdered brothers, uncles slaughtered nephews, and the provinces that had once trembled at the mention of Ottoman power now watched the empire consume itself. Stefan navigated this chaos like a man crossing a frozen lake, testing every step for the crack that would plunge him into darkness. His first move was to back Suleiman, the eldest surviving son. Suleiman controlled the European territories, Thrace, parts of the Balkans, the old Ottoman heartland west of the Bosphorus. He was also the weakest of the brothers, which made him the most willing to bargain. The deal Stefan extracted was remarkable. In exchange for Serbian military support, Suleiman returned territories that had been taken from Serbia decades earlier. He reduced tribute payments. He acknowledged Stefan as an independent ruler rather than a vassal. On paper, Serbia was almost free. On paper. In practice, Stefan was simply betting on one horse in a race where any horse might be shot mid-stride. He provided Suleiman with troops when asked, fought alongside Ottoman forces against Ottoman forces, watched Christians and Muslims alike die in battles that had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with which Turkish prince would rule the ruins. Historians still debate whether Stefan could have achieved true independence during the interregnum. The chaos was total, the Ottomans too busy killing each other to enforce vassal obligations. Hungary might have provided an alliance. The Byzantine emperor in Constantinople was looking for any advantage against his Turkish neighbours. A coordinated Christian front might have, the two most useless words in history. Stefan knew the Ottomans would reunite eventually. They always did. The system Bayezid had built was too effective, the bureaucracy too entrenched, the military tradition too strong. Whoever won the civil war would inherit that machinery and turn it outward again. And when that happened, small kingdoms that had bet wrong would cease to exist. So Stefan bet on everyone. He supported Suleiman until Suleiman was murdered by his brother Musa in 1411. Then he negotiated with Musa, providing minimal support while secretly sending messages to Musa's remaining rival, Mehmed. When Mehmed's fortunes rose, Stefan shifted his backing accordingly, providing just enough assistance to earn gratitude without committing enough to make him a target if Mehmed lost. It was exhausting, it was demeaning, it was survival. Meanwhile, he used the breathing space to build. The fortress of Golubac was strengthened. Belgrade's walls grew higher. New mining operations opened in the Serbian hills, producing silver that could buy mercenaries or bribe Ottoman officials as circumstances required. The monastery at Rasava neared completion, its scriptorium already beginning the work of copying and preserving Orthodox manuscripts. Stefan wrote more poetry during these years. His verses took on a darker tone, meditations on impermanence, on the futility of earthly glory, on the gap between what men want and what they achieve. He had watched an empire fall. He had watched his master die in a cage. He had no illusions left about permanence. The year 1413 brought resolution of a sort. Mehmed finally defeated his last brother, reunifying the Ottoman Empire under a single ruler. The new sultan was cautious where his father had been reckless, diplomatic where Bayezid had been confrontational. He consolidated rather than expanded, rebuilt rather than conquered. And he remembered who had helped him. Stefan's careful balancing act had paid off. Mehmed confirmed Serbian territories, maintained reduced tribute rates, treated Stefan as an ally rather than a subject. It was the best relationship Serbia would have with the Ottomans for a century. But it was still a relationship between predator and prey. Mehmed didn't need to conquer Serbia, he simply needed to wait. Time was on the Empire's side. Time was always on the Empire's side. Stefan understood this. He understood that everything he was building, the fortresses, the monasteries, the careful diplomatic structures, was temporary. That his successors would have to be even more skilled than he was, or everything would be lost. He began looking for other patrons, other protections, other chains that might be lighter than Ottoman ones. The Hungarians were obvious. King Sigismund, the same man who had fled Nicopolis by boat while Stefan was helping slaughter his army, now ruled the largest Christian kingdom in Central Europe. He was looking for allies against the Ottomans. He was willing to forgive old debts if new ones could be incurred. Stefan sent envoys. Negotiations began. The dragon was learning to serve two masters. It would not make him safer. It would make him indispensable. The ceremony took place in Buda, in the great hall of the Hungarian royal palace, with all the pageantry a medieval kingdom could muster. Banners hung from every rafter. Nobles in their finest silks lined the walls. King Sigismund himself presided, wearing the crown of the Holy Roman Empire that he had just acquired, dispensing honours to those he wished to bind to his cause. Stefan Lazarevich knelt before him and received the Order of the Dragon. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Here was a man who had helped destroy the largest crusade in European history, now being inducted into an order dedicated to fighting the Ottomans. Here was an Ottoman vassal still technically obligated to provide troops when the Sultan called, swearing Christian brotherhood with the very king whose army he had helped massacre at Nicopolis. But politics makes strange knights. Sigismund needed Balkan allies. Stefan needed Christian protection. The Order of the Dragon, a chivalric society Sigismund had founded specifically to unite Christian princes against the Turkish threat, provided the framework for an arrangement that benefited both. The medal was simple enough. A dragon curled in a circle, wings spread, consuming its own tail. Stefan would wear it for the rest of his life. He would incorporate it into his personal heraldry, stamp it on his coins, display it prominently in every formal portrait. The Dragon of Serbia, the knight who served the Sultan and the Holy Roman Emperor simultaneously. Historians still debate whether Stefan believed in the Order's stated purpose, the defence of Christendom against Islam, or whether he simply saw membership as diplomatic currency. His actions suggest the latter. He continued paying Ottoman tribute after his investiture. He continued providing troops when Mehmed requested them. He attended ceremonies in Buda that celebrated Christian unity, and then returned to Serbia to negotiate with Turkish envoys. He was, in other words, exactly what survival required him to be: everything to everyone, committed to nothing except his own kingdom's continued existence. The years following Stefan's Hungarian alliance were perhaps his most productive. Freed temporarily from immediate Ottoman pressure by Mehmed's cautious approach, backed by the theoretical support of Christian Europe, Stefan transformed Serbia from a collection of feudal holdings into something approaching a centralized state. Legal reforms standardized administration across the kingdom. Mining codes established clear rules for the extraction of silver and gold, channeling revenue toward the crown rather than local lords. A new capital began to take shape at Belgrade, its position at the confluence of the Danube and Sava rivers, making it both commercially valuable and militarily defensible. The monastery at Rasava, Stefan's greatest architectural achievement, was completed during these years. It was more than a religious institution. Its scriptorium became a centre for copying manuscripts, preserving Orthodox texts that might otherwise be lost to Ottoman conquest. Its walls could shelter refugees. Its treasury could finance resistance if resistance ever became possible. Stefan funded the monastery lavishly, visiting regularly, consulting with monks about theological questions that had interested him since his years of Ottoman captivity. He had always been literate, always inclined toward reflection. Now he had the resources to indulge that inclination, while also building institutions that might outlast him. But the double game took its toll. Serbian nobles complained constantly. Some wanted closer ties to Hungary, full commitment to the Christian cause, open defiance of Ottoman demands. Others argued for accommodation, pointing out that the Turks were inevitable, that resistance only brought destruction. Stefan navigated between these factions, promoting neither, trusting neither, using both against each other to maintain his own position. He executed 2 more nobles during this period. Conspiracies against the throne, the official explanation claimed. More likely, men who had grown too loud in their criticism, too public in their demands for policies Stefan couldn't afford to adopt. The loneliness of kingship settled around him like armour. He had no son. His marriage had produced only daughters, and Serbian succession law required male heirs. His nephew Juraj, his sister's child, waited in the wings with barely concealed impatience. Stefan knew that everything he built would pass to hands he couldn't fully control. He wrote poems about death, about the transience of glory, about the way even great achievements crumble before the indifference of time. His verses circulated through Christian and Muslim courts alike, praised for their wisdom, their elegance, their acceptance of impermanence. The dragon had a kingdom, had honours from emperors, had reputation that crossed continental boundaries. The dragon was also tired, and the dragon knew that tired men make mistakes. The Ottoman Empire was rebuilding. Mehmed's son Murad was ambitious in ways his father had not been. The breathing space was ending. The real tragedy was just beginning. The decade between 1417 and 1427 was Stefan's golden age, and he knew, he must have known, that gold tarnishes faster than any other metal. Serbia had never been more prosperous. The silver mines at Novo Brdo produced enough wealth to fund armies, build fortresses, and maintain a court that rivaled anything in the Balkans. Merchants from Venice and Ragusa competed for trading privileges. Craftsmen from across Orthodox Christendom sought patronage at Stefan's court. The cultural flowering that would later be called the Serbian Renaissance was in full bloom, and all of it stood on sand. Ottoman pressure had eased during Mehmed I's careful reign, but Mehmed died in 1421. His son, Murad II, was cut from different cloth, ambitious, militaristic, determined to restore the empire's aggressive expansion. Murad's first target was Constantinople, which he besieged unsuccessfully in 1422. His second target was the Balkans. Stefan felt the change immediately. Tribute demands increased. Ottoman advisors began appearing at his court, ostensibly to help with administration, actually to monitor his activities. The troops he was required to provide for Ottoman campaigns grew from thousands to tens of thousands, draining Serbia's military capacity. The Hungarian alliance that had seemed so valuable now became a liability. Sigismund was busy with European affairs, church councils, imperial politics, conflicts with the Hussites in Bohemia. He had little attention to spare for the Balkans. The Order of the Dragon, never more than a symbolic arrangement, provided no actual protection when Ottoman cavalry appeared on Serbian borders. Stefan built faster, more fortresses, more walls, more preparations for a siege that felt increasingly inevitable. Belgrade became his obsession. The city's strategic value was obvious. Whoever controlled Belgrade controlled the Danube crossing, controlled the invasion route between Central Europe and the Balkans, controlled the hinge point of any major conflict. Stefan reinforced its walls until they were the strongest in southeastern Europe. He stockpiled weapons, food, equipment for a garrison that might have to hold indefinitely. Historians still debate whether Stefan was preparing to resist the Ottomans or simply to bargain from strength. Probably both. Probably neither. Probably he was doing what he had always done, preparing for every contingency, trusting no outcome, building options that might keep him alive regardless of which direction history turned. The monastery at Rasava received its final embellishments during these years. Stefan endowed it lavishly, ensuring its monks would have resources to continue their work for generations. The scriptorium copied texts at an unprecedented rate: theological works, historical chronicles, translations from Greek and Latin. If Serbian culture was going to be submerged by Ottoman conquest, at least some of it would be preserved in parchment and stone. But even as he built, Stefan's health was failing. He was in his mid-50s now, old by medieval standards, ancient by the standards of men who had lived his life. The wounds accumulated over 3 decades of warfare had never fully healed. His joints ached. His digestion troubled him. He spent more time in his private chambers, writing poetry, receiving only essential visitors. His nephew Juraj grew bolder. The young man had Ottoman contacts of his own. Quiet negotiations that didn't quite rise to the level of treason, but made clear which way he expected the wind to blow. Stefan knew about these contacts. Everyone at court knew. But what was to be done? Execute his own nephew, his only plausible successor, and leave Serbia without any legitimate heir? The dragon was dying by inches, and the vultures were circling. In 1426, Sigismund demanded payment for his protection. Hungary wanted Belgrade. The fortress Stefan had spent years strengthening, the strategic linchpin of his entire defensive strategy, was to be handed over to Hungarian control. In exchange, Sigismund would confirm Stefan's rule over the rest of Serbia and provide military assistance against Ottoman aggression. Stefan agreed. What choice was there? The transfer happened in 1427, just months before Stefan's death. Hungarian troops occupied the fortress he had built. Stefan's flag came down from walls he had raised stone by stone. The key to Serbian defence now belonged to a king who lived hundreds of miles away and had priorities that didn't include Serbian survival. It was a pragmatic decision. It might have been the right decision. Belgrade in Hungarian hands was still better than Belgrade in Ottoman hands. But it felt like surrender. It felt like watching his life's work pass into the possession of people who would never understand what it had cost. Stefan spent his last months at Rasava, among the monks and the manuscripts, writing final verses about impermanence and resignation. He had built a kingdom. He had preserved his people for 40 years. He had done everything that survival demanded. It would not be enough. He knew it would not be enough. The dragon's fire was guttering out, and winter was coming. The letters came faster now, each one carrying demands Stefan could not afford to grant and could not afford to refuse. From the Ottoman court, reminders that tribute was due, that Serbian troops were expected for the spring campaign, that Murad II did not forget those who had served his grandfather and expected similar service from their successors. The tone was polite, almost friendly. The threat was unmistakable. From Hungary, inquiries about Stefan's health, expressions of concern for Serbian stability, suggestions that perhaps Hungarian assistance with governance might be appropriate given the circumstances. Sigismund had Belgrade now. He wanted more. He always wanted more. From his own nobles, complaints, demands, warnings about Ottoman agents, warnings about Hungarian agents, requests for favours, notifications of feuds, the endless petty business of a kingdom full of men who wanted things Stefan couldn't provide. He read them all, he answered none. The spring of 1427 found Stefan at his estates near Pristina, not far from Kosovo Polja, where everything had begun. He was perhaps thinking of his father. The sources don't say, but it seems likely. A man facing his own death often returns to the deaths that shaped him. His body was failing in specific, humiliating ways. The chronicles mention difficulty walking, bouts of confusion, periods when he couldn't keep food down. Medieval medicine had nothing to offer except prayer and bleeding, neither of which proved particularly effective. And still the letters came. Murad II had begun pressuring Serbian border regions. Nothing dramatic, no full invasion, no major battle, just raids, probing attacks, villages burned, cattle driven off, peasants carried into slavery. The the kind of pressure that didn't quite justify a military response, but made clear what a military response would eventually face. Stefan's instructions to his commanders were defensive. Hold the fortresses. Don't provoke. Wait. Wait for what? He was dying. His nephew was negotiating with the Ottomans. Hungary had his best fortress. There was nothing to wait for except the inevitable. Historians still debate whether Stefan made a final attempt to break free of both masters. Some sources mention secret envoys sent to Venice, to the Pope, to the Byzantine Emperor, anyone who might provide an alternative to the two-headed vice that was crushing Serbia. If these envoys existed, they accomplished nothing. The great powers of Christendom had their own problems. A dying Serbian prince was not among them. Juraj visited him that spring. The sources describe a tense meeting, formal courtesies exchanged between uncle and nephew, each knowing what the other was thinking, neither willing to speak it aloud. Juraj brought gifts, fine cloth, spices, news from the Ottoman court where he was increasingly welcome. Stefan received them graciously. After Juraj left, Stefan ordered his personal guard doubled. He stopped eating food he hadn't watched prepared. These precautions were probably unnecessary. Juraj was patient and Stefan was dying anyway, but old habits of survival don't release their grip easily. The nights were the hardest. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by pain and by dreams he never described to anyone. He kept writing poetry, though his handwriting had deteriorated to the point that scribes were needed to produce fair copies. His final verses returned again and again to images of departure, of journey's ending, of the soul preparing to leave a body that had served it longer than expected. He dictated letters to his mother's grave. Helen had died a decade earlier, finally released from the impossible task of holding Serbia together while her son learned to kill for the Sultan. He dictated prayers for his father's soul, for the souls of the men he had killed at Nicopolis, for the souls of the Christians and Muslims alike who had died in his wars. Whether these prayers were sincere penitence or political performance, meant to be heard, meant to shape how he would be remembered, the sources don't say. In May, he made a final tour of Rasava. The monastery was complete now, every stone in place, the scriptorium functioning, the monks trained in the methods of preservation that Stefan had funded for years. This, at least, would endure. This, at least, could not be transferred to Hungarian control or conquered by Ottoman armies. He donated his personal library to the monastery's collection. He endowed additional prayers to be said in perpetuity for his soul and the souls of his family. He said goodbye to the abbot, to the monks he had known for decades, to the manuscripts whose copying he had personally supervised. Then he rode back to Pristina to die. The dragon had one last task, controlling his own ending, choosing where and how and in whose company he would leave a world he had fought so hard to survive. This, at least, he could do. This, at least, belonged to him. The letters kept coming. He stopped reading them. June 1427. The heat pressed down on Pristina like a hand trying to smother a candle. Stefan Lazarevic lay in a darkened room, surrounded by physicians who couldn't help him and courtiers who were already calculating their positions under the next ruler. He was 55 years old. He had outlived every expectation, had survived Kosovo, survived the Ottoman court, survived Nicopolis and Ankara, and a decade of civil war, survived the balancing act that should have killed him a dozen times over. Now survival had run out. The deathbed of a medieval prince was never private. Priests came and went, administering sacraments, offering prayers, ensuring that the departing soul had every possible advantage in whatever judgment awaited. Nobles clustered in antechambers, pretending grief, actually negotiating the transition of power. Scribes stood ready to record final words that might become legal precedent or historical artifact. Stefan's final words, according to the chronicles, concerned Serbia's future. He confirmed his nephew Juraj as heir, there was no one else, and urged the assembled nobles to maintain unity against external threats. He recommended continued cooperation with Hungary, the preservation of Orthodox faith, the defence of monasteries and churches, standard deathbed fare, what every dying king was supposed to say, but some sources record something else. A moment when Stefan, briefly lucid, looked at the gathered faces and said something that shocked them into silence. "I served the Sultan. I served the Emperor. I served Serbia. And in the end, I served only time." Historians still debate whether this quote is authentic. It appears in only one chronicle, and that chronicle was written decades after Stefan's death. But authentic or not, it captures something true about the man and his impossible life. He had spent 40 years threading needles that shouldn't have been threadable. He had killed Christians for Muslims and accepted honours from Christians for fighting Muslims. He had built fortresses that would be taken, and monasteries that would be burned, and a kingdom that would not survive the century. He had done everything right, by the standards of survival, and it had bought his people perhaps 2 generations of existence. Time, the only master that never showed mercy. Stefan Lazarevich died on July 19, 1427. The sources say he died peacefully, in full possession of his faith, surrounded by those who loved him. Medieval sources always say this about dying princes. Whether it was true in Stefan's case, whether anyone actually loved a man who had spent his life manipulating everyone around him, the chronicles don't reveal. His body was carried to Rasava for burial, just as he had ordered. The funeral procession wound through Serbian territories that were already slipping toward chaos. Đurađ was in the capital, claiming the throne, negotiating with Ottoman envoys who had arrived suspiciously quickly. The power transfer was happening before Stefan's corpse was cold. At Rasava, the monks prepared a tomb worthy of their patron. Fine marble, carved inscriptions praising Stefan's piety and wisdom, his military achievements and literary accomplishments. The epitaph called him Despot of Serbia, a Byzantine title he had received from the emperor in Constantinople, and listed his victories, his foundations, his service to the Orthodox faith. It did not mention Nicopolis. It did not mention the Christians he had killed. It did not mention the tribute he had paid, the Ottoman troops he had led, the decades of vassalage that had defined his reign. Legacies are always selective. The dead cannot defend their own complexity. Outside the monastery walls, the vultures were already descending. Ottoman raids intensified within months of Stefan's death. Hungarian pressure increased. Đurađ proved less skilled at the balancing act than his uncle, not through any personal failing, but because the balance was no longer possible. The breathing space Stefan had bought was exhausted. The bill was coming due. The scriptorium at Rasava continued its work for a while longer. Monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, preserving texts that would otherwise be lost, adding Stefan's own poetry to the collection they maintained. Some of these manuscripts survive to the present day, fragments of a culture that the Ottomans would eventually absorb, evidence that something called Serbia had existed and had produced things worth preserving. But manuscripts don't stop armies. Culture doesn't deflect cavalry charges. Stefan had known this, had built walls alongside scriptorium, had tried to provide both physical and spiritual defences for his people. Neither type proved sufficient in the end. The fall came faster than anyone expected. Within 3 decades of Stefan's death, everything he had built was either conquered, transferred, or transformed beyond recognition. The Dragon's Kingdom became a ghost haunting Ottoman chronicles, a footnote in histories written by the victors. Đurađ Branković, Stefan's nephew and successor, inherited an impossible situation and made it worse. His negotiations with the Ottomans produced a peace that satisfied no one. His attempts to balance Hungarian and Turkish demands collapsed repeatedly into war. By 1439, 12 years after Stefan's death, the Ottoman army marched into Serbia proper, and Đurađ fled to Hungary with whatever treasures he could carry. The fortress of Smederevo, which Đurađ had built as his capital, surrendered after a brief siege. Its walls, the strongest Stefan's engineers could design, proved insufficient against Ottoman artillery. The technology of warfare had shifted in the decades since Kosovo, and fortifications that might have held in 1389 crumbled under bronze cannons in 1439. Đurađ returned briefly, squeezed between Ottoman and Hungarian conflicts, ruling fragments of territory that shrank with each passing year. He died in 1456, having spent nearly 30 years watching his uncle's legacy disintegrate. His successors, men Stefan had never met, children of political marriages arranged for temporary advantage, lasted even less time. By 1459, Serbia ceased to exist as an independent entity. The Ottoman conquest was complete. The land where Stefan had built his monasteries became a province of the empire he had once served. The nobles who had advised him, conspired against him, competed for his favour. Their families were either destroyed or absorbed into Ottoman service, their names forgotten within generations. Belgrade, the fortress Stefan had strengthened and then surrendered to Hungary, held out longer than the rest. It became a frontier outpost, the edge of Christian Europe, besieged repeatedly by Ottoman armies. In 1521, under Suleiman the Magnificent, it finally fell. The walls Stefan had raised were breached by gunpowder. The city he had envisioned as Serbia's salvation became an Ottoman stronghold for 3 centuries. Historians still debate whether Stefan could have done anything differently, whether more resistance, less accommodation, different alliances might have produced a different outcome. The consensus is probably not. The Ottoman Empire was too large, too efficient, too inexorable. Serbia was too small, too divided, too strategically located to avoid conquest. Stefan bought time, perhaps a generation of time, and that was all anyone could have bought. But the debate misses something important about Stefan's life and legacy. He didn't just buy time, he preserved culture. The manuscripts copied at Rasava survived the conquest, hidden in monastery walls, carried by refugees to other Orthodox lands, preserved by monks who remembered their patron's instructions. Serbian literature, Serbian religious traditions, Serbian identity, these things persisted through centuries of occupation, through conversion pressures and cultural suppression, through everything the Ottoman system deployed to absorb its conquests. When Serbia finally re-emerged in the 19th century as a semi-autonomous principality, then an independent kingdom, then a modern nation, it reached back to Stefan Lazarević as a founding figure. Not Stefan the Ottoman vassal, not Stefan the Christian crusader, Stefan the poet, Stefan the builder, Stefan who had created institutions that outlasted conquest. The irony would not have surprised him. He understood, better than most medieval rulers, that power is temporary and culture endures. He wrote poetry about impermanence while building fortresses. He funded scriptoriums while leading cavalry charges. He made himself useful to everyone because usefulness bought time, and time could be converted into something more permanent than any military victory. His tomb at Rasava was desecrated during the Ottoman conquest, then restored, then desecrated again, then restored again. It still exists, a marble sarcophagus in a monastery that has been rebuilt multiple times, surrounded by walls that have been breached and repaired and breached again. Pilgrims visit. Scholars study the inscriptions. Tour guides explain that here lies Stefan Lazarević, the dragon, the despot, the man who served sultans and emperors and somehow kept his people alive. They do not explain what it cost him. They cannot explain what it cost him. Some costs are beyond explanation. Stefan Lazarević died in his bed, attended by priests and physicians, surrounded by the trappings of power he had accumulated over half a century. It was a better death than his father received. No severed head, no enemy spitting in his mouth, no crows at Kosovo. By the standards of medieval princes, it was almost peaceful. But peaceful is not the same as triumphant, and survival is not the same as victory. The empire he saved at Nicopolis endured. The crusade he destroyed was never rebuilt. The Ottoman system he served conquered everything he tried to protect. His military genius, his political skill, his decades of careful navigation, all of it extended Serbian independence by perhaps 2 generations, long enough for his nephew to fail where he had succeeded. History remembers him as a hero. History is wrong. He was a survivor, a pragmatist, a man who understood that principles are luxuries small kingdoms cannot afford. He did what he had to do, served who he had to serve, killed who he had to kill. And when the end came, he accepted it with the same calculated resignation he had brought to everything else. The crows at Kosovo had taught him something that first day, standing among his father's killers, watching his father's head defiled. They had taught him that the world does not reward virtue, that strength serves whoever holds the chain, that survival is its own morality, its own justification, its own reward. He lived by that lesson for 40 years. He died having proven it correct. The monasteries he built still stand. The poems he wrote are still read. The fortress he surrendered is still visited by tourists who know nothing about the man who raised its walls. The empire endured, the man did not, and somewhere, in whatever peace or torment awaits medieval princes who did terrible things for understandable reasons, Stefan Lazarevich knows that this was always how the story would end. The dragon served the Sultan, the dragon served the Emperor, the dragon served Serbia, the dragon served everyone except himself.